When a tiny patrol boat charged a battleship, the enemy turned away. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? A vessel weighing barely 60 tons, armed with nothing more than torpedoes and machine guns, forcing a 35,000-ton warship to retreat. Yet on the morning of October 25, 1944, in the waters off Samar Island in the Philippines, this exact scenario unfolded during what would become known as the Battle off Samar, one of the most desperate and heroic naval engagements in American history. The Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever constructed, accompanied by 3 additional battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, bore down on a small group of American escort carriers and their defenders. Standing between these steel giants and the vulnerable carriers were 7 American destroyers and destroyer escorts, vessels never designed to face capital ships in open combat. What happened in the next 3 hours would defy every principle of naval warfare and rewrite the definition of courage under fire. To understand the magnitude of this David versus Goliath confrontation, we must first grasp the strategic situation that brought these forces together. By October 1944, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur were returning to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise to the Filipino people. The invasion of Leyte Gulf represented a mortal threat to Japan's empire. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from the oil and resources of Southeast Asia that fueled its war machine. The Japanese High Command devised a desperate, complex plan called Shogo, or Operation Victory. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the powerful center force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, through the San Bernardino Strait and into Leyte Gulf, where he would annihilate the American invasion fleet. To draw away the American carriers that could stop him, Admiral Ozawa's northern force would act as bait, sacrificing Japan's remaining carriers to lure Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet away from the landing beaches. The plan worked almost perfectly. Halsey took the bait, racing north with his fast battleships and carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Unknown to the Americans, Kurita's center force had survived its passage through the Philippine archipelago. Though bloodied, having lost the mighty Musashi to repeated air attacks, Kurita's force remained formidable. For battleships including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Standing in their path was Task Unit April 3rd, 77, callsign Taffy 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, small, slow carriers built on merchant ship hulls, designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support, not fleet combat. Their thin hulls earned them the nickname Jeep Carriers and the less flattering Kaiser Coffins after their builder. Screening these vulnerable carriers were 3 destroyers, USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Herman, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts, USS Samuel B, Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond. Dawn broke clear and calm on October 25, 1944. Aboard the ships of Taffy 3, sailors went about their morning routines. Some ate breakfast. Others wrote letters home. The escort carriers launched their first anti-submarine patrols of the day, their planes carrying depth charges and light bombs meant for ground support, not the armor-piercing weapons needed to threaten battleships. At 0645 hours, lookouts aboard the escort carrier USS White Plains spotted strange shapes on the horizon to the northwest. Within minutes, the shapes resolved into pagoda-like masts, the distinctive profile of Japanese battleships. The enemy was just 17 miles away and closing fast. Aboard the flagship USS Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague could scarcely believe the reports. American intelligence had assured him that Halsey's Third Fleet had the San Bernardino Strait covered. The Japanese center force was supposed to be in retreat, not bearing down on his carriers at flank speed. Yet there they were, the massive silhouettes of Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, accompanied by heavy cruisers whose 8-inch guns outranged anything Taffy 3 possessed. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Yamato alone displaced more than all of Taffy 3's escort carriers combined. Her 9 18.1-inch guns fired shells weighing 3,200 pounds each, projectiles the size of automobiles that could penetrate 16 inches of armor at 20 miles. The escort carriers' hulls were barely 3/4 of an inch thick. A single hit from Yamato's main battery would be catastrophic. At 0658 hours, Kurita's battleships opened fire. Colored splashes, red, green, yellow, purple, erupted around the American carriers as different Japanese ships used dimark shells to spot their fall. The Japanese used these different colors to distinguish which ships' shells were landing where, a technique that now created a deadly rainbow in the waters around Taffy 3. Admiral Sprague immediately ordered his carriers to turn east toward a rain squall visible on the horizon and work up to their maximum speed of 17.5 knots. He ordered the carriers to make smoke, and the small ships began pumping out thick, black clouds from their funnels and chemical smoke generators. But Sprague knew that smoke and speed wouldn't be enough. His carriers needed time to launch aircraft, time to reach the squall, time for help to arrive. To buy that time, someone would have to stand and fight. Commander Ernest E. Evans, commanding officer of the destroyer USS Johnston, didn't wait for orders. A Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma who wore his battle helmet painted with the words, "Johnny," Evans had told his crew when he assumed command. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Now, at 0705 hours, Evans ordered his ship to flank speed and turn directly toward the Japanese fleet. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 376 feet long, displacing 2,700 tons. She carried 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes. Charging alone toward the Japanese battleships, she resembled nothing so much as a terrier attacking a pack of wolves. "Commence firing," Evans shouted, and Johnston's 5-inch guns opened up, their shells arcing toward the heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the Japanese formation. At the same time, Evans maneuvered his ship through a hail of fire, zigzagging at 35 knots to throw off enemy rangefinders. Massive geysers of water erupted around Johnston as 14-inch and 8-inch shells straddled her. The Japanese couldn't believe a single destroyer would dare attack their entire fleet. At 7,000 yards, barely 3.5 miles, Johnston launched her torpedoes. 10 long lance torpedoes, each carrying 600 pounds of explosives, fanned out toward the Japanese cruisers. Evans held his course, watching, waiting. Then, at 0724 hours, a massive explosion rippled along Kumano's bow. One torpedo had found its mark, blowing off the cruiser's bow and forcing her out of the formation. First blood to the Americans. But Johnston's lone charge had only begun the battle. Inspired by Evans's audacity, the other destroyers of Taffy 3's screen surged forward. USS Hull, commanded by Commander Leon S. Kintberger, turned toward the enemy. USS Herman, under Commander Amos T. Hathaway, followed suit. Even the smaller destroyer escorts joined the attack. Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, a ship displacing barely 1,700 tons, armed with only 2 5-inch guns. By 0730 hours, all 7 screening ships were charging into Admiral Kurita's formation, their guns blazing, their crews fighting with desperate courage against impossible odds. They wove between the Japanese heavy ships like water bugs harassing sharks, firing torpedoes, laying smoke, and drawing fire away from the escort carriers. The Japanese formation, which had maintained rigid discipline during the approach, began to dissolve into confusion as individual captains maneuvered to avoid torpedoes and engage these suicidally aggressive attackers. The American destroyers had bought precious minutes, but now they would pay the price. At 0730 hours, 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo smashed into Johnston's hull. One shell demolished her aftergun mounts. Another penetrated the engine room, killing everyone inside and reducing Johnston's speed to 17 knots. A third shell destroyed the ship's gyro compass, forcing Evans to steer manually. Fire broke out across the destroyer's deck. The ship's communication systems were wrecked. Half her guns were knocked out. Commander Evans, wounded by shrapnel that tore away 2 fingers and shredded his shirt, refused medical treatment. Blood streaming down his bare chest. His shirt had been blown completely off. He continued to con his ship, shouting steering orders through sound-powered phones while Johnston continued to fire her remaining forward guns at any Japanese ship that came within range. USS Hull faced even worse. As she pressed her torpedo attack, Japanese cruisers surrounded her from 3 sides. For 30 minutes, Hull traded shots with ships 10 times her size. She was hit again and again, more than 40 times by shells ranging from 5 inches to 14 inches. Her bridge was destroyed. Her engine rooms flooded. Her guns were knocked out one by one. At 0830 hours, with her deck awash and listing heavily, Commander Kintberger ordered abandon ship. Hull rolled over and sank at 0855, taking 253 of her crew of 350 down with her. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts earned immortality in these desperate minutes. Lieutenant Commander Copeland drove his tiny ship straight at the heavy cruiser Chikuma, closing to such short range that the Japanese cruiser's main battery couldn't depress low enough to hit her. For 35 minutes, Sammy B., as her crew called her, slugged it out with a ship 4 times her size. Her 2 5-inch guns fired so rapidly that they exhausted their ready ammunition and began firing star shells, anti-aircraft ammunition, at the Japanese cruiser, setting fires on Chikuma's superstructure. Then Japanese shells found Samuel B. Roberts. A 14-inch shell from Battleship Congo passed completely through the ship, leaving a hole large enough to drive a car through. More shells followed, destroying her engine room and detonating her magazine. At 0905 hours, Sammy B. rolled over and sank, her crew abandoning ship into oil-slicked waters. Of her 224 crew members, 90 would die, many from wounds, exposure, and shark attacks during 2 days in the water before rescue arrived. By 0900 hours, the situation appeared hopeless. The American destroyers had been smashed. Johnston was crippled and burning. Hull had sunk. Samuel B. Roberts was going down. Herman, though still afloat, was damaged and low on ammunition. The escort carriers, despite the heroic sacrifice of their screen, were being overtaken by Japanese cruisers. Shells were falling among them with increasing accuracy. At 0850 hours, the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay took her first hit, an 8-inch shell from heavy cruiser Chikuma. More hits followed as the Japanese closed the range. Fires broke out. The carrier began to lose speed. At 0907 hours, with her engine room flooded and fires spreading, Gambier Bay capsized and sank, the only American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. Admiral Sprague had nothing left to give. His carriers were making smoke and dodging shells, but the Japanese were too close, too numerous, too powerful. Aircraft from the carriers, fighters armed only with machine guns, torpedo bombers with nothing but depth charges meant for submarines, made desperate attack runs, strafing Japanese ships or making dry runs without weapons just to distract enemy gunners. Pilots reported that they could see Japanese officers on bridge wings pointing at them, directing fire. Aboard the crippled Johnston, still afloat despite her catastrophic damage, Commander Evans continued to fight his ship. With only one functioning gun mount, steering by hand signals, and dead in the water, Johnston engaged a formation of Japanese destroyers attempting to finish off the escort carriers. Evans's crew loaded, aimed, and fired their single operational 5-inch gun as fast as humanly possible, their shells splashing around Japanese destroyers that outweighed Johnston several times over. But it was in this darkest moment, when defeat seemed certain and annihilation inevitable, that something extraordinary happened. At 0911 hours, Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force from the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, gave an order that would puzzle historians for decades. All units, break off action. Proceed north, then west. The Japanese turned away. For battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, the most powerful surface force Japan had assembled since Midway, ceased fire and withdrew, leaving the battered remnants of Taffy 3 alone in the smoke-covered sea. The American sailors couldn't believe what they were seeing. Huge Japanese ships that minutes before had been closing for the kill were turning away, their massive wakes visible as they increased speed and headed northwest, away from the escort carriers. Why did Kurita turn away? What made him break off an attack he was on the verge of winning? The answer lies in the cumulative effect of the Americans' desperate resistance. From Kurita's perspective on Yamato's bridge, the situation appeared far different than the reality. The ferocious destroyer attacks had thrown his formation into disarray. 3 of his heavy cruisers were damaged or sunk. Kumano crippled by Johnston's torpedo, Suzuya sunk by air attack, Chikuma heavily damaged by aircraft, and Samuel B. Roberts' guns. His ships had scattered across miles of ocean, making coordinated action impossible. The constant air attacks, even by aircraft carrying nothing but machine guns, had convinced Kurita that he faced fleet carriers, not escort carriers. No escort carrier, he reasoned, would have aircraft that aggressive and well-coordinated. He believed he was fighting elements of Halsey's Third Fleet, not the small escort force that actually opposed him. The American smoke screens made it impossible to see what he was really facing. Moreover, Kurita was exhausted. His force had been under air attack for 3 days straight. He had lost the super battleship Musashi the previous day. He had been in continuous combat since entering the Sibuyan Sea. Intelligence reports, both before and during the battle, confused him about American dispositions. He expected resistance, but the suicidal ferocity of the destroyer attacks suggested to him that the Americans had far more forces in the area than they actually did. Perhaps most critically, the small American ships had convinced Kurita that where there was so much smoke and chaos, there must be greater forces waiting. Japanese doctrine emphasized preserving the fleet for the decisive battle. Kurita, believing he faced fleet carriers and possibly battleships hidden in the smoke and rain squalls, decided to withdraw and regroup rather than risk his remaining heavy ships. The tiny patrol boats, the destroyers and destroyer escorts that had no business fighting battleships, had achieved the impossible. Through sheer audacity, aggressive tactics, and willingness to sacrifice themselves, they had created an illusion of strength from weakness. They had convinced one of Japan's most experienced admirals that he faced defeat when victory was within his grasp. For the men in the water, however, the battle was far from over. Survivors from Gambier Bay, Samuel B. Roberts, and Hull floated in oil-slicked seas, surrounded by debris and the bodies of shipmates. Sharks arrived within hours. Many wounded men succumbed to their injuries. Others, driven mad by thirst and exposure, swam away from rescue groups and were never seen again. Johnston, still afloat but dying, continued to fire her single operational gun at Japanese destroyers until the very end. At 0945 hours, with water flooding through dozens of shell holes, fires consuming her superstructure, and Japanese destroyers closing in for the kill, Commander Evans gave the order to abandon ship. At 1010 hours, Johnston rolled over and sank, her colors still flying. A Japanese destroyer pulled alongside the sinking destroyer. The Japanese captain, recognizing the incredible courage of Johnston's crew, rendered honors, ordering his crew to attention and saluting the sinking American warship. Of Johnston's crew of 327, only 141 survived. Commander Evans was not among them. The battle off Samar ended as quickly as it had begun. By 10:30 hours, the Japanese center force was in full retreat, heading back towards San Bernardino Strait. They would never threaten the Leyte landings again. Admiral Kurita's force had lost 3 heavy cruisers and suffered damage to several other ships. More importantly, they had lost their nerve and their opportunity. Taffy 3 had lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. More than 1,000 American sailors were killed or missing, but they had saved the invasion fleet. Had Kurita pressed his attack and entered Leyte Gulf, he would have found hundreds of transports, supply ships, and amphibious vessels packed with soldiers and supplies, vessels that could not run and could barely defend themselves. The massacre would have been unprecedented, potentially forcing the abandonment of the Philippines invasion. Instead, 7 small ships and 6 escort carriers held the line. They had faced down an enemy force that outweighed and outgunned them by orders of magnitude, and through courage that bordered on the supernatural, they had prevailed. Commander Ernest E. Evans of USS Johnston was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation read, in part, "Outgunned and outmaneuvered, he conducted his ship in a heroic and distinguished action against a vastly superior force. His valiant fighting spirit throughout this historic battle will venture as an inspiration to all who served with him." Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts was awarded the Navy Cross. The ship herself became known as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Decades later, survivors still gathered annually to remember shipmates lost in those desperate hours off Samar. The battle off Samar became required study at naval academies worldwide. It demonstrated that courage, initiative, and aggressive action could overcome seemingly impossible odds. It showed that in naval warfare, as in all warfare, the moral component, the will to fight when reason suggests surrender, often matters more than material strength. Admiral Sprague, in his after-action report, struggled to explain what his force had accomplished: the failure of the enemy to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God. In the years since, historians have debated Kurita's decision to withdraw. Some call it a failure of nerve. Others, more charitably, suggest he made a reasonable decision based on incomplete information. But perhaps the real answer is simpler. He had been convinced by men and ships 1/10 the size of his own that he was beaten. The tiny patrol boats had charged the battleships, and the battleships had blinked first. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.